In the previous video, I demonstrated how you can go about painting a sphere just like this using loose paper masks. I touched on the reasons why I teach this using loose paper masks or loose shields. This is the way I normally work. I think it's a better way because at the end of the day, it makes you a more versatile artist. Not only are you practicing some of the fundamental strokes like lines and some dagger strokes while you're creating artwork like this, but you're also learning how to use these loose shields or loose paper masks because it's challenging to control your overspray not only around the outside perimeter of the shield, but also to control the overspray when the air is blowing the paper around and you're trying to prevent overspray from traveling underneath the mask. I also touched on the fact that you can use an adhesive back mask to create the same image. And rather than me telling you that that's not the best way to go about it, I decided to showcase both. So in this video, we're going to look at using the adhesive back mask to create the same thing. There are pros and cons to both. I'm not saying that either is right or wrong. It's up to you to decide what works best for you. So let's take a look at some of the advantages as well as the disadvantages when it comes to using an adhesive back mask to create the same image. So I'm using an adhesive backed paper mask. This is a hand cut mask. It's cut from transfer tape, which is the exact same tape I use when I'm working with vinyl or computer cut masks. And you'll notice that the painting process is virtually the same. I'm still using a series of lines and some dagger strokes here and there in order to create this entire image. One of the advantages to using a adhesive backed mask is the fact that it's stuck to the surface. So we don't have to worry about overspray traveling under the mask around the perimeter of our sphere. Be aware that you can get some paint bleeding underneath the mask if the mask is not adhered to the surface very well. You can repair those areas when that happens if needed. That's a separate video on its own. I'm also going a little bit darker around the perimeter on this demonstration compared to what we did with the loose paper mask. That's essentially because I don't have to worry about overspray traveling underneath the mask at this point. Another advantage to using an adhesive back mask is if your mask is large enough, you really don't have to worry about overspray traveling outside of the perimeter of your mask either. In this case, my mask is plenty large enough that I'm not concerned about overspray getting around the outside of the mask. You can also see how that right edge is slightly folded up just because it didn't want to stick to this paper all that well. But that's also a shield that will catch overspray and direct it back toward the artwork. Another advantage to using an adhesive back mask for something like this is the fact that it allows you to work a little bit faster when it comes to the painting portion of the artwork. I can go in and put color on here much faster using this mask compared to the loose paper mask because again, I'm not concerned about the air moving the mask around and allowing overspray to travel underneath the mask. So this is a little bit faster process when it comes to painting something simple like this particular shape. It may be a wash when you take into consideration the time it takes to actually cut this mask out and then apply it to the surface, as well as removing the outside perimeter and then covering the sphere when we do the shadow toward the end. Again, these are all lines that I'm painting within the sphere now at varying distances from the surface. That's how I achieve either a wide pattern to create the shading, or a closer, more thin line to get things a little bit darker. I did go a little bit darker on this sphere compared to the one we did in the previous video, and I think that just has to do with the fact that I was working faster. I was putting the paint on relatively quickly. This was mainly to showcase, again, the pros and cons between both examples. One of the disadvantages to using an adhesive backed mask like this is I'm using a semi-opaque transfer tape, which means you can see through it. There's not really a lot to see. You can see on the left edge the sphere that we painted in the previous video. So you can see through this masking material, but it's not super clear. When you have other artwork surrounding what you're painting, for instance, if we had something in the background behind this sphere, it becomes a little more difficult to judge your contrast, to decide how dark or how light things need to be in order to keep a balance with your contrast when you can't actually see through the masking material clearly. Something else that can affect that is the overspray going around the outside edge of the mask. As you can see, around the circumference of this sphere, there's overspray building up on the actual mask material, and that can make it even harder, because once that overspray starts going on to the material, then you can no longer see through that area. There are ways to mitigate that. There are clear transfer tapes that you could use to do this as well. It's just something to be aware of. Again, the process is very much the same as what we did in the previous video. I'm building up the darker areas in the shadowed portions of the sphere. I'm leaving the area in and around where I want the highlight to be quite a bit lighter, and I'm also creating that secondary reflected highlight on the bottom backside of the sphere where the shadow will be. So this is obviously an easier approach to painting something simple like this sphere. Again, there's nothing wrong with it. You choose what works the best for you. I do use adhesive backed masks for very specific things. It's normally something like lettering or a logo, something that really requires a super crisp, clean, sharp line all the way around the subject that I'm painting. The vast majority of the time I am using freehand shields, whether that's a hand-cut loose paper mask or a store-bought freehand shield. That's just the way I prefer to work, and we'll cover really the reason why I choose to work that way at the end of this video. But either way works. Either method will get you good results. Again, this is essentially the same thing we did with the paper masks as far as the painting process goes. I'm working on building the darkest shadows around the right side, the bottom of the sphere. I'm leaving the area in and around where the highlight is going to be quite a bit lighter, just like we did previously, although this sphere is a little bit darker compared to the first example. And I've also created that secondary reflected highlight down on the bottom right side where the shadow will be. I'm still just using lines at varying distances from the surface of the canvas in order to create all of this shading and blended area. Here I've come back in with the eraser in order to create that specular highlight, and you'll notice that I'm using kind of random circular strokes with the eraser, and what that does is it allows me to create the highlight, but it's also creating a slight bit of texture in the highlight as well, which just adds a little bit more realism into your highlight when you're using an eraser. Again, you could come back in with some opaque white paint and do the same thing and practice your dots with the airbrush if you choose to do so. Now we can cover up what we just painted and begin adding the shadow. So rather than taping a loose freehand shield up to the surface, now I can use the cutout portion of this adhesive back mask in order to mask off the sphere to create the shadow. I usually try to put the cutout portion of the mask in before I remove the outer perimeter, just to help line things up. It doesn't always line up perfectly. In this case, I decided to move it because I really want to make sure that the bottom right edge and the very bottom of the sphere is lined up well. That's where the shadow is going to be. I'm not as concerned about the rest of the area surrounding the sphere, and I am using a squeegee to make sure this is pressed down well so that I don't get paint bleeding underneath the mask, and the transfer tape doesn't like to stick to plain paper all that well. So once again, now I'm coming in and using dagger strokes in order to create the shadow for our sphere, starting on the actual masked portion and dragging the paint off of that, allowing it to fade into nothing as I'm dragging it out, or that's what I'm attempting to do anyway. And I'll build this up until I'm happy with how dark it is. Another disadvantage to using adhesive back masks is it's not as easy to lift the mask and check your contrast. We talked about the contrast earlier. Now that I have the sphere that we just created covered with this semi-opaque transfer tape, it's very difficult to see any detail underneath the mask. It's very difficult to see how dark or how light our sphere actually is. You can peel the mask up slightly and look at some of what you've done, but you run the risk of tearing the mask or stretching the mask, which can cause issues as far as it sitting back down on the surface and not getting overspray into a tear, or if you stretch it, it may have a slight bubble in there which can allow overspray to travel under the mask as well. So that's another disadvantage to using the adhesive back masks. You can't easily remove the mask to check your contrast and make sure that things are the way that you want them to be. I think that looks pretty good for the shadow, so we'll move the mask out of the way. So both of these methods produce very nice results. In fact, they can produce results that are extremely close to one another. If I had taken a little bit more time to keep my saturation value levels the same as the first example, they would look extremely similar. I got a little bit darker on the second example, as I mentioned earlier. The main reason why I choose to use the freehand shields or loose shields compared to an adhesive back mask is very evident when you look at these both a little bit closer. What I don't necessarily like about the adhesive back mask in this example is we have a super clean, very crisp, sharp outline all the way around the circumference of our sphere. It's not perfect because it was a hand-cut mask, so I don't have a perfect circle. There are some very minor imperfections. It looks like it was cut out. It looks like an adhesive mask was used. You could get a better result if you have access to a plotter and used a plotter in order to cut out a perfect circle, as long as you apply that and don't have any wrinkles or anything when you're applying it to the surface. I really prefer the loose paper mask or a loose shield when it comes to this, because we still have a very nice clean edge around the circumference of our sphere, but it's not perfect. It's a little bit fuzzy on the very edge, especially on this side where I have a little bit of overspray that got underneath my paper mask. But this is a much cleaner, more realistic look, in my opinion, compared to this example. And don't forget, you can always take your eraser and erase some of the overspray around the outside edge of your sphere if you choose to do so. Again, I'm not saying either one of these methods is right or wrong. It's up to you to decide which method you are going to use for any given project. I wanted to show the differences between both as well as the similarities. More often than not, I choose to use this method because I think it provides a more realistic look in the finished product compared to the adhesive back mask. This is also a little bit of a primer for the more complex shapes, specifically the cube, when we get to that section, because we will likely be using a little bit of masking to create that. That pretty much wraps up what I wanted to cover for the sphere portion of this series of videos. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. Next time, we will take a look at the cone. So until then, I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I'll see you all then.